The scorching Nevada sun beat down mercilessly on the endless expanse of red rock and sagebrush. Miles from the nearest town, where cell towers couldn't reach, and the only sounds were wind whistling through ancient stone formations, something extraordinary was about to unfold. A discovery so remarkable that it would challenge everything we think we know about survival, hope, and the unbreakable bonds between strangers. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What rancher Thomas Mitchell found carved into the walls of Whispering Canyon would haunt him for the rest of his life. But before we get to that moment that changed everything, we need to go back 3 months earlier, to a tragedy that set 7 young souls on an impossible journey into the wilderness. Riverside Children's Home had stood for 47 years on the outskirts of Carson City, Nevada. Its brick walls had sheltered hundreds of children over the decades, providing a safe haven for those who had nowhere else to go. On the night of March 15th, those same walls would fail to protect the 7 children sleeping peacefully in there beds. Sarah Chun, 16 and the unofficial leader among the older kids, woke first to the acrid smell of smoke. Her eyes snapped open in the darkness of the dormitory she shared with 3 other girls. The smell wasn't coming from the kitchen, where Mrs. Patterson sometimes burned the evening bread. This was different, sharp, chemical, dangerous. Emma Katie. Wake up! Sarah shook her roommates urgently. Emma Rodriguez, 14, bolted upright. Immediately, her survival instincts honed from years of uncertainty. Katie Sullivan, only 12 but wise beyond her years, was already reaching for her shoes before she was fully conscious. In the boys' dormitory across the hall, 11-year-old twins Jake and Luke Morrison were helping their younger roommates. Marcus Thompson, 13 and built like a linebacker despite his age, was already at the window checking for escape routes. The youngest of their group, 8-year-old Lily Anderson, clutched her worn teddy bear as 10-year-old David Park tried to calm her fears. The fire spread with unnatural speed through the old building. Later, investigators would determine that faulty electrical wiring in the basement had ignited stored cleaning supplies, creating a perfect storm of combustible materials. But in those terrifying moments, all 7 children knew that their home was burning and they had to get out. Mrs. Patterson, the night supervisor, had already evacuated the other children through the main exit, but a collapsed beam blocked the older kids' path to safety. The smoke was thickening by the minute, and the temperature was rising dangerously. The window! Marcus shouted, pointing to the large window at the end of the boys' dormitory. It faced the back of the property, away from where the fire department would likely set up their equipment. Sarah made a split-second decision that would save their lives but set them on an unimaginable path. We jump, it's only 2 stories, but we go together and we take care of each other. One by one, they climbed through the window. Marcus went first, dropping into the darkness and immediately calling up that it was safe. Then David helped Lily, staying calm despite his own fear. The twins went next, followed by Katie and Emma. Sarah came last, taking one final look at the only home she'd known for 3 years before disappearing into the night. They landed in the overgrown garden behind the building, bruised but alive. The sound of sirens filled the air, growing closer by the minute. But as they watched their home consumed by flames, a horrifying realization struck them. In all the chaos and evacuation procedures, no one had noticed that 7 children were missing. The fire department arrived within minutes, followed by emergency medical teams and social services personnel. The children watched from the shadows as Mrs. Patterson frantically gave statements to officials, accounting for each child under her care, but the paperwork was confused in the chaos. A visiting social worker had taken several children to a temporary shelter earlier that day for a field trip, and in the confusion, it appeared that all children were accounted for. Sarah gathered the group behind a large storage shed, far enough from the scene to avoid detection, but close enough to observe. "They think we're already safe," she whispered, watching as the last of the fire trucks began packing up their equipment. "They're not looking for us." "We should go tell them," Katie said, her young voice trembling. "Tell them what?" Emma asked, bitterly. "That we're here? Then what happens?" "They split us up. Send us to different homes in different cities. I've been through this before. Once they lose track of you in the system, they make sure it doesn't happen again by keeping you separated." Emma's words carried the weight of experience. She had been in the system since she was 6, moved from home to home, family to family. The bonds she had formed with these children were the strongest she had ever known, and the thought of losing that connection terrified her more than the uncertainty ahead. Marcus, despite being only 13, understood the harsh realities of their situation. "Emma's right. My cousin aged out of the system last year. He told me stories about kids who get lost in paperwork, shuffled around until they give up hope of staying together. The twins, Jake and Luke, exchanged one of their wordless communications that only they seemed to understand. Luke finally spoke for both of them. We stay together, no matter what." David, holding Lily's hand tightly, nodded his agreement. At 10 years old, he had become fiercely protective of the younger girl, and the thought of being separated from her was unbearable. Lily, clutching her teddy bear, looked up at Sarah with complete trust. "Where will we go?" Sarah felt the weight of leadership settle on her shoulders. At 16, she was old enough to understand the magnitude of what they were considering, but young enough to believe they could survive anything as long as they had each other. "We'll figure it out," she said with more confidence than she felt. "We've taken care of each other here, and we'll take care of each other out there. But we do it together, or we don't do it at all." As dawn broke over the smoldering remains of Riverside Children's Home, 7 children walked away from everything familiar and into the vast Nevada wilderness. Sarah had grabbed a backpack during their escape, and it contained a few precious items: a flashlight, some granola bars she had been saving, a small first aid kit, and most importantly, a detailed topographical map of the region that she had been using for a school geography project. The map would prove invaluable in the days ahead, but in those first hours, it served mainly to highlight just how alone they were. The nearest town was Millbrook, population 847, and it lay 23 miles across some of the most unforgiving terrain in Nevada. They walked through the morning, staying off the main roads to avoid detection. Marcus and David took turns carrying Lily when her small legs grew tired. Emma, who had spent time in foster homes throughout rural Nevada, shared her knowledge of desert survival, how to find water, which plants might be edible, and how to conserve energy in the heat. By midday, the temperature had soared to over 90 degrees, and they were forced to seek shelter under a rocky overhang. This was when Sarah first noticed the series of caves that dotted the canyon walls around them. The geography was striking: red sandstone formations, carved by millions of years of wind and water, creating natural shelters that had protected travelers for centuries. "We could rest in one of those caves," Katie suggested, pointing to a particularly large opening about 50 feet up the canyon wall. Jake, who had always been the more adventurous of the twins, was already examining the rock face for handholds. "I think we can climb up there. The rock looks solid, and there are plenty of places to grip." They spent the next hour carefully making their way up to the cave entrance. What they found inside exceeded their wildest expectations. The cave was spacious, with multiple chambers extending deep into the rock. Ancient pictographs decorated some of the walls, suggesting that this place had sheltered people for thousands of years. More importantly, they discovered a small underground spring near the back of the main chamber. The water was clear and cold, bubbling up from deep within the earth. Emma tested it carefully, remembering advice from a foster father who had been a geologist. "It's good," she announced after several minutes of observation. It's been filtered through all that rock. This is safer than most tap water. What began as a temporary shelter quickly became something more permanent. The children discovered that the cave system was far more extensive than they had initially realized. There were sleeping chambers, storage areas, and even a natural chimney that would allow them to have small fires without detection. Sarah took charge of organizing their new home, assigning sleeping areas and establishing rules for sharing resources. Marcus and David focused on making the cave livable, creating beds from dried grass and constructing simple furniture from fallen branches and flat stones. The twins proved invaluable as scouts and foragers. Their natural agility made them excellent climbers, and they quickly learned the lay of the land for miles around their hidden sanctuary. They discovered edible plants, located additional water sources, and most importantly, established routes that would allow them to remain undetected by any search parties. Emma's street smarts proved essential for their survival. She had learned to read people and situations from her years bouncing between homes, and she applied those skills to reading the desert environment. She could predict weather changes by watching cloud formations, find shelter before storms hit, and most crucially, she developed an uncanny ability to sense when they were not alone in the wilderness. Katie, despite being one of the youngest, emerged as the group's emotional anchor. She had a gift for sensing when someone was struggling and knowing exactly what to say or do to lift spirits. Her optimism became infectious, helping the others maintain hope even in their darkest moments. Lily, the youngest at 8 years old, adapted to their new life with the remarkable resilience that children often display. She appointed herself the guardian of their small fire, carefully tending it and ensuring they always had warmth and light. Her teddy bear, which she had named Guardian, became a symbol of comfort for the entire group. David, despite being only 10, took on responsibilities that would challenge adults. He became their engineer, using his natural curiosity and problem-solving skills to create tools and improve their living conditions. He fashioned fishing hooks from metal scraps, created water collection systems during rare rainstorms, and even built a rudimentary alarm system to warn of approaching visitors. As weeks turned into months, the children developed routines that gave structure to their hidden life. They established a system of cave maintenance, food gathering, and security watches that ensured their survival while maintaining their freedom. But Sarah knew that their situation couldn't last forever. At 16, she understood that they were living on borrowed time. Eventually, someone would discover their cave, or they would face an emergency that they couldn't handle alone, or simply run out of the resources they needed to survive. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It was during their 3rd month in the cave that Sarah made a decision that would ultimately lead to their rescue, though not in the way anyone might expect. She began carving a message into the smooth wall near the cave entrance, not a desperate plea for help, but a detailed record of their story. Working by firelight during the quiet evening hours, Sarah carefully etched their names, their ages, and the date they had arrived at the cave. But more than that, she began telling their story in stone, how they had found each other, how they had survived, and most importantly, how they had chosen to stay together despite impossible odds. "What are you doing?" Emma asked one evening, finding Sarah working on her message by the light of their small fire. "Leaving a record," Sarah replied, not stopping her careful work. "If something happens to us, if we don't make it, I want someone to know that we exist, that we mattered, that we chose this together." Emma studied the growing message, reading the careful words that Sarah was permanently etching into stone. "You think someone will find this? Maybe, someday. And when they do, they'll know that 7 kids once lived here, and they took care of each other." Emma picked up a sharp stone and began working alongside Sarah. "Then let's make sure they know the whole story. Night after night, the message grew. Other children contributed their own words, their own memories, their own hopes. What started as a simple record became something larger, a testament to the bonds that had kept them alive, the love that had sustained them, and the courage that had brought them so far from everything they had ever known. The message was nearly complete. When rancher Thomas Mitchell first noticed the strange scratches on his fence posts that marked the boundary of his property, he had been running cattle in this area for 23 years, and he knew every rock, every tree, every natural landmark. The scratches were new, and they followed a pattern that suggested human activity. Thomas was a man who noticed details. At 54 years old, he had spent most of his adult life alone on his ranch, developing the kind of observational skills that come from quiet living and careful attention to the world around him. The scratches bothered him not because they represented damage to his property, but because they suggested that someone was out there in the wilderness, possibly in trouble. 3 days after first noticing the scratches, Thomas decided to follow the trail. He packed supplies for a day-long search, saddled his most reliable horse, and set out into the canyon country that bordered his ranch. He had no idea that he was about to discover something that would challenge his understanding of human resilience and redefine his own purpose in life. The trail led deeper into the canyon system than Thomas had explored in years. As he followed the subtle signs, disturbed rocks, broken branches, barely visible footprints in sandy soil, he began to realize that whoever had passed this way had done so repeatedly, over an extended period of time. When he finally reached the cave where 7 children had built their hidden world, Thomas Mitchell stood at the entrance for several long minutes, reading the message that Sarah and the others had carved into the stone. The words told a story so extraordinary that he initially doubted what he was seeing, but the evidence was undeniable. Fresh ashes from a recent fire, sleeping areas that showed signs of regular use, storage areas carefully organized with gathered food and supplies, and most convincingly, the message itself, too detailed, too personal, too real to be anything other than the truth. Thomas had found them. But the children, following their carefully established security protocols, had seen him coming long before he reached their cave. They were watching from hidden positions, trying to decide whether this lonely rancher represented salvation or the end of their freedom together. The next few minutes would determine the fate of 7 children who had survived 3 months in Ioni, the wilderness, on nothing but hope, determination, and their unbreakable bond with each other. Thomas Mitchell, reading their message carved in stone, was about to make a choice that would change all their lives forever. Thomas Mitchell had faced many difficult decisions in his 54 years, but none quite like this. Standing at the mouth of the cave, reading the children's carved testimony, he felt the weight of 7 young lives pressing down on him. His weathered hands traced the careful letters etched into stone, each word revealing more about the extraordinary circumstances that had brought these children to his remote corner of Nevada. That the message wasn't just a record, it was a plea for understanding. These weren't runaway delinquents or troubled kids acting out. They were survivors who had made an impossible choice between staying together and surrendering to a system that would separate them forever. Thomas had grown up in foster care himself, though that was 40 years ago when the system was even less forgiving than it was today. He remembered the crushing loneliness of being shuffled from home to home, never quite belonging anywhere, never knowing if the next placement would be better or worse than the last. The fear of separation that these children described in their message resonated deep in his chest, but he also understood the legal realities. 7 missing children meant 7 ongoing investigations, search parties, federal involvement, media attention. Every day they remained missing, the situation became more complicated, more dangerous for everyone involved. He studied the cave more carefully, noting the ingenious improvements the children had made. A water collection system using pieces of Plastic sheeting stretched between rocks. Food storage areas protected from animals and weather. Sleeping quarters are arranged for both privacy and security. These kids hadn't just survived, they had thrived. The sound of falling pebbles made him turn toward the cave entrance. 50 feet away, partially concealed behind a rocky outcropping, a teenage girl watched him with alert, intelligent eyes. This had to be Sarah, the leader mentioned in the carved message. "I'm not here to hurt anyone," Thomas called out, keeping his voice calm and his hands visible. "I read your message." "All of it." Sarah emerged slowly from her hiding place, and Thomas could see the others positioned strategically around the cave. Entrance. They had been watching him the entire time, evaluating the threat he might represent. Their defensive positions showed tactical thinking that impressed him despite the circumstances. "Are you going to turn us in?" Sarah asked directly. At 16, she had learned that dancing around difficult questions only made them worse. Thomas considered his answer carefully. "That depends on what you want to happen next." "We want to stay together," Emma said, stepping into view. Her voice carried the hard edge of someone who had been disappointed too many times to trust easily. "And if that's not possible?" Thomas asked. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of an impossible situation. Finally, Marcus spoke up. "Then we keep running." Thomas saw the determination in their faces, the way they unconsciously positioned themselves to protect the younger children. These weren't naive kids playing at independence. They had survived 3 months in conditions that would challenge experienced outdoorsmen. They had formed a family unit stronger than many biological families. He had known. "There might be another way," Thomas said slowly, an idea beginning to form in his mind. "But it would require trust. On both sides." Thomas sat down on a flat rock near the cave entrance, making himself less imposing. "I live alone on a ranch. About 8 miles from here. 2,300 acres, most of it empty land that borders national forest. The nearest neighbor is 12 miles away." The children exchanged glances, communication flowing between them in the subtle way that people develop when they depend on each other for survival. "I'm not talking about hiding you forever," Thomas continued. "But I might be able to buy us some time to figure out a better solution than just marching you back to the authorities." "Why would you help us?" Katie asked, her 12-year-old directness cutting through the adult conversation. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "Because 40 years ago, I was in a situation not so different from yours, and because nobody helped me then." He told them about his own childhood in the system, about being separated from his younger sister when he was 14. How he had never seen her again, despite years of searching once he was old enough to try. How that loss had shaped every decision he had made since. "The system isn't evil," he said. "But it's not designed for situations like yours. It's designed to process cases, move paperwork, and minimize liability. What you've built here," he gestured toward their carefully organized cave, "this is about something the system doesn't know how to handle. Real family bonds." David, who had been listening intently, stepped forward. "What would we have to do?" "First, we'd have to make you officially missing persons instead of presumed dead or relocated. That means contacting the authorities, but on our terms. Second, we'd have to prove that staying together is in your best interests. That means documentation, character witnesses, maybe even legal representation. And in the meantime?" Sarah asked. "In the meantime, you'd live on my ranch. Legally, temporarily, while we sort out the paperwork. I have space, I have resources, and most importantly, I have privacy." The twins, Jake and Luke, had been whispering to each other in their private language. Luke finally spoke for both of them. "What's the catch?" Thomas smiled grimly. "The catch is that this gets a lot more complicated before it gets simpler. There will be social workers, court hearings, background checks, home inspections. And there's no guarantee it works out the way we want." Lily, who had been clutching her teddy bear throughout the conversation, surprised everyone by speaking up. "Will we have to split up?" "Not if I can help it," Thomas said. And something in his voice made them all believe him. 2 hours later, 7 children who had lived like ghosts for 3 months walked openly across Thomas Mitchell's ranch land. They had packed their few possessions, carefully extinguished their fire, and said goodbye to the cave that had been their sanctuary. The ranch house was larger than they had expected, a sprawling single-story structure built from local stone and weathered wood. It looked like it had grown out of the landscape rather than being imposed upon it. Solar panels glinted on the south-facing roof, and a wind generator turned lazily in the afternoon breeze. "Built most of it myself over the past 20 years, Thomas explained as they approached the front porch. "It's designed to be self-sufficient. We're 40 miles from the nearest power line." Inside, the house was comfortable, but clearly the home of a man who had lived alone for many years. The furniture was functional rather than decorative books, filled built-in shelves along most walls, and everything was meticulously clean and organized. "There are 4 bedrooms," Thomas said, leading them through the house. "The master bedroom is mine, obviously. The other 3 can be arranged however you think works best." The children were struck by how quiet the house felt. After months of sleeping in a cave where every sound echoed, the solid walls and carpet seemed to absorb noise completely. "There's a full kitchen, obviously, laundry room here. Solar batteries and backup generators are in the basement, along with food storage and emergency supplies. The internet is satellite-based, so it's not great, but it works." Emma was examining the kitchen with professional interest. "You cook for yourself?" "For 20 years, Thomas confirmed. "I'm not fancy, but I'm competent. I can cook," Emma said. "I learned in some of my foster homes. For this many people, it makes sense to have someone coordinate meals." Sarah was studying Thomas carefully. "You said you'd been alone for 20 years. What changed your mind about having people here?" Thomas paused at the living room window, looking out over the vast landscape that surrounded his home. "I guess I finally admitted to myself that being alone and being lonely aren't the same thing. I chose to be alone, but I never chose to be lonely." That evening, after the children had settled into their temporary rooms and shared their first cooked meal in months, Thomas sat in his home office staring at his telephone. The call he was about to make would set everything in motion there. Would be no going back once he picked up that receiver. Sarah knocked on his doorframe. "Are you sure about this?" "No," Thomas admitted. "But I'm sure that doing nothing isn't an option." He had spent the afternoon researching the legal requirements for his situation. Nevada had specific laws about harboring minors, but it also had provisions for emergency placement and temporary guardianship. If he handled this correctly, he might be able to establish legal custody while they worked on a permanent solution. The phone call was to Janet Morrison, a social worker Thomas had met years earlier during a case involving one of his seasonal workers. She was known for being practical rather than bureaucratic, someone who understood that real life didn't always fit neatly into official categories. "Janet, it's Thomas Mitchell. I need to report 7 missing children who are currently safe at my ranch." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds. "Thomas, I'm going to need you to repeat that." Over the next 30 minutes, Thomas explained the situation as carefully as he could. The fire at Riverside Children's Home, the children's decision to stay together rather than risk separation, their survival in the wilderness, his discovery of their cave and his decision to provide temporary shelter. "Thomas, do you understand the legal implications of what you're telling me?" Janet's voice was carefully neutral. "I understand that 7 children have been missing for 3 months, and they're now safe and healthy and asking for help. I understand that they've demonstrated remarkable maturity and survival skills. And I understand that the traditional system failed them once already. The traditional system didn't fail them. There was a fire, and Janet, they've been listed as missing persons for 3 months. Nobody knew where they were. If that's not system failure, I don't know what is. Another long pause. Are you requesting emergency foster placement? I'm requesting whatever legal framework will allow these children to stay together while we figure out a permanent solution. If that's emergency foster placement, then yes. Thomas, you're not licensed as a foster parent. You've never been through the training, the background checks, the home inspections. But I have space, resources, and most importantly, their trust. They came to me voluntarily. They're asking for help, not hiding from it. Janet sighed heavily. I'll need to come out tomorrow, bring a team. We'll need to interview each child separately, assess the living situation, and contact their caseworkers from before the fire. Their previous caseworkers lost track of them for 3 months, Thomas pointed out. Thomas, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but you're in over your head. This isn't a simple placement situation. These children are going to need therapy, educational assessment, medical evaluation, which they're more likely to cooperate with if they feel safe and secure, which they won't if you separate them. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Janet explaining procedures and Thomas pushing for flexibility. Finally, they reached a compromise. Janet would come to the ranch the next day with a minimal team herself, one other social worker, and a nurse for basic medical evaluations. No police, no media, no removal unless the children were in immediate danger. In exchange, Thomas would begin the process of applying for emergency foster certification, and the children would cooperate fully with interviews and assessments. After hanging up, Thomas found the 7 young people gathered in his living room, trying to look like they hadn't been listening to every word of his conversation. So, Sarah asked, so tomorrow we find out if the system can bend enough to accommodate what you've built together. The children spent that evening transforming themselves from wilderness survivors back into presentable young people. Hot showers revealed how much weight they had lost during their months in the cave, but also showed the lean muscle they had developed from their active outdoor life. Emma worked with Katie and Lily to braid their hair and find clean clothes that fit reasonably well from Thomas's collection of work shirts and jeans. The boys cleaned up more easily, though Marcus had grown several inches during their time away and looked awkward in clothes that were now too small. More challenging was preparing emotionally for the scrutiny they would face. Thomas sat them down around his kitchen table and explained what to expect. They're going to ask you why you ran away instead of seeking help immediately after the fire. You need to have a clear, consistent answer. Because we knew they would separate us, Sarah said immediately. That's not enough. You need to explain why staying together was worth the risk you took. You need to help them understand that what you've created isn't just friendship, it's family. David had been quiet throughout the discussion, but now he spoke up. What if they don't understand? Thomas looked around the table at 7 young faces that had seen too much hardship for their ages. Then we keep fighting until they do. Emma's street-smart instincts kicked in. What do we say about the cave? About how we survived? The truth. You tell them exactly what you did, how you organized yourselves, how you took care of each other. You make them understand that you weren't just hiding, you were building something. The twins had been unusually quiet, but Luke finally voiced what they were all thinking. What if they split us up anyway? Thomas met each of their eyes before answering. Then we cross that bridge when we come to it. But I want you to understand something. Tomorrow isn't about convincing them to let you stay together. Tomorrow is about showing them that you already are together and have been for 3 months. The question isn't whether you can function as a family unit. You've already proven that. The question is whether the system is flexible enough to recognize what already exists. That night, the children barely slept. They could hear Thomas moving around the house, making preparations, organizing documents. turning his solitary home into a space that could accommodate official scrutiny. Sarah lay in the comfortable bed, first real bed she had slept in since the fire, and stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow would determine whether their months of survival had been worth it, or whether they had simply delayed the inevitable. But as she listened to the quiet breathing of Katie and Emma in the other beds in the room, she realized something important. They had already won. Whatever happened tomorrow, they had proven to themselves that their bonds were stronger than circumstances, stronger than institutions, stronger than fear. The system might separate their bodies, assign them to different homes in different cities, but it could never separate what they had built together in that cave, what they had carved into stone, what they carried in their hearts. Tomorrow they would face judgment, but tonight they were still together, still a family, still exactly what they had chosen to become on that night when their world burned down around them. The sun would rise on their most important day, and they would meet it as they had met every challenge for the past 3 months together. The black SUV appeared on Thomas's ranch road at exactly 9 in the morning, followed by a smaller sedan. Through the living room window, the children watched as 3 adults emerged from the vehicles, each carrying official-looking briefcases and clipboards. Janet Morrison was a woman in her mid-40s with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She moved with the efficient stride of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions under pressure. Behind her came Dr. Patricia Yates, a pediatric nurse practitioner whose gentle demeanor couldn't quite hide the sharp intelligence in her eyes. The third member of their team was Robert Chun, a social worker specializing in complex placement cases, and notably, no relation to Sarah despite sharing her surname. Thomas met them at the front door, his handshake firm but his expression carefully neutral. "Janet, thank you for keeping the team small." "Don't thank me yet," Janet replied, her voice professional but not unkind. "We're here to assess a very unusual situation, Thomas. The children's safety is our primary concern." "It's mine too," Thomas said, stepping aside to let them enter. Living room had been arranged to accommodate the meeting, with chairs positioned in a rough circle that wouldn't feel too much like an interrogation. The children were already seated, their posture alert, but not defensive. They had spent the morning preparing for this moment, and it showed in their coordinated appearance and calm demeanor. Dr. Yates immediately noticed what Thomas had observed the night before. The children showed signs of weight loss and sun exposure, but also unexpected physical fitness. Their eyes were clear, their movements coordinated, and despite their obvious nervousness, they projected an air of competence that was unusual for children who had supposedly been living rough for 3 months. "Before we begin individual interviews," Janet announced, "I'd like to hear your story from the beginning, all together, so we can understand the group dynamic." Sarah took the lead, as everyone had expected she would. But instead of launching into a defensive explanation, she did something that caught the social workers off guard. She asked a question. "What do you know about the night of the fire?" Robert Chun consulted his notes. According to the report from Riverside Children's Home, all residents were successfully evacuated. The building was a total loss, but there were no casualties. "That's not correct," Emma said quietly. 7 children were unaccounted for in the confusion. "We were never evacuated because nobody knew we were missing." Janet's expression sharpened. "The official report states that all children were accounted for." "The official report was wrong," Marcus said, his 13-year-old voice carrying unexpected authority. "We were there. We lived through it. We know what happened." For the next hour, the children told their story with a precision that impressed even the skeptical Robert Chun. They described the fire, their escape through the second-story window, their realization that they had been overlooked in the evacuation procedures. But more importantly, they explained their reasoning for not immediately revealing themselves to authorities. "We weren't running away from responsibility," Katie explained, her 12-year-old logic cutting through the adult assumptions. We were running towards staying together. Dr. Yates had been taking notes throughout the discussion, but now she spoke up. Can you describe your living conditions in the cave? What followed was a detailed account of survival techniques that left the three officials exchanging glances of surprise. The children described their water purification methods, their food storage systems, their division of labor, their security protocols. This wasn't the story of children barely surviving. This was the story of children who had created a functioning community under impossible circumstances. You're telling us that 7 children, the youngest being 8 years old, successfully survived in the wilderness for 3 months without any adult supervision or outside assistance. Robert Chun's tone suggested he found this difficult to believe. We're telling you that 7 people who happened to be children successfully survived. David corrected, his 10-year-old directness making the point more effectively than any adult argument could have. The next phase of the evaluation involved separate interviews with each child, conducted in different rooms throughout the house. Janet took Sarah into Thomas's home office, while Dr. Yates set up a medical station in the guest bedroom. Robert Chun used the kitchen table for his interviews with the younger children. Sarah's interview was the most comprehensive, as Janet needed to understand the leadership dynamics that had kept the group together. Tell me about the decision-making process in your group. How did you handle disagreements? The same way any family handles disagreements, Sarah replied. We talked through problems, we compromised when necessary, and we prioritized the safety and well-being of everyone involved. But you're not a family, Sarah. You're 7 unrelated children from different backgrounds. Sarah was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. With respect, Miss Morrison, I think you're wrong about what makes a family. We may not share DNA, but we've shared everything else that matters. We've protected each other, provided for each other, made sacrifices for each other. If that's not family, then what is? Meanwhile, Dr. Yates was conducting medical examinations that revealed the children's remarkable physical condition. Despite their ordeal, they showed no signs of malnutrition or serious health issues. Their skin was tanned and weathered, their hands calloused from outdoor work, but their vital signs were all within normal ranges. Emma, can you show me your hands? Dr. Yates asked during Emma's examination. Emma extended her hands, revealing calluses and small scars that told the story of 3 months of manual labor. I know they look rough, but they're strong. We had to learn to work with our hands to survive. I'm not criticizing Emma. I'm actually impressed. These hands tell me that you've been physically active and productive. That's not what I would expect from children who were simply hiding and scavenging. In the kitchen, Robert Chun was discovering that the younger children were far more articulate and mature than their ages suggested. 10-year-old David explained their engineering improvements to the cave with the precision of someone twice his age. 8-year-old Lily described their daily routines with the organizational skills of a seasoned camp counselor. Lily, weren't you scared living in the cave? Robert asked. Sometimes, Lily admitted. But I was more scared of being separated from my family. But these aren't your biological siblings, Lily. Lily looked at him with the patient expression children reserved for adults who don't understand obvious things. They're my family because we chose each other. That's stronger than just being born in the same place. The twins' interview proved particularly challenging for Robert, as Jake and Luke had developed their own communication style that didn't translate well to official questioning. They answered in overlapping sentences, finishing each other's thoughts, and clearly saw themselves as a single unit rather than 2 separate individuals. We need to understand your individual perspectives, Robert explained. Can you each tell me, separately, why staying together is important to you? Jake and Luke exchanged one of their wordless communications. Then Luke spoke. That's like asking someone to explain why they need both lungs to breathe. We function as a unit. We always Have. But you're two different people with different needs, different personalities. Are we? Jake interrupted. Because for the past 3 months, we've been half of a team that kept 7 people alive. Separately, we're just 2 kids. Together, we're something more. By afternoon, the 3 officials had completed their individual assessments and were huddled in Thomas's office, comparing notes and trying to make sense of what they had discovered. These aren't typical at-risk children, Dr. Yates said, reviewing her medical findings. They're physically healthy, emotionally stable, and demonstrating remarkable resilience. Whatever they've been through, it hasn't damaged them, it's strengthened them. Robert Chun was less convinced. But they've been out of school for 3 months. They've had no adult supervision. They've been exposed to dangers that could have killed them. We can't just ignore those factors because they happen to survive. Can't we? Janet asked. Robert, in your experience, how many children in the system would have handled this situation as well as these 7 did? The question hung in the air because all 3 officials knew the answer. Most children who aged out of foster care struggled with basic life skills, independence, and forming healthy relationships. These 7 children had demonstrated all of those abilities under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. The legal issues are complex, Janet continued. They've been missing for 3 months. There are ongoing investigations, federal involvement, media attention. We can't just pretend none of that happened. Thomas, who had been listening from the kitchen, finally joined the conversation. What if we don't pretend it didn't happen? What if we use it as evidence that these children are capable of making mature decisions about their own lives? Thomas, they're minors. The law doesn't recognize their right to make those kinds of decisions. The law also doesn't recognize their right to stay together, but they've proven that staying together is essential to their well-being. Maybe it's time to question whether the law is serving these children's best interests. Dr. Yates leaned forward in her chair. There's something else we need to consider. The psychological bond these children have formed isn't just strong, it's therapeutic. They've essentially created their own support system, their own therapy group, their own family structure. Disrupting that could cause significant psychological harm. But maintaining it requires us to essentially validate their decision to run away, Robert pointed out. What precedent does that set for other children in the system? What precedent does separating them set? Thomas countered. That the system values bureaucratic convenience over human bonds? That children who form strong relationships will be punished for caring about each other. The debate continued for another hour, with the 3 officials weighing legal requirements against human needs, policy against practicality. Finally, Janet called for a break and asked to speak with the children one more time as a group. Children gathered in the living room, their faces carefully composed but their body language revealing their anxiety. They had overheard enough of the adult conversation to know that their fate was being decided, and the outcome was far from certain. We've completed our assessment, Janet began, and we need to discuss your options going forward. Sarah spoke. For the group, what are our options? The standard procedure would be to place you in separate foster homes while we work on finding more permanent solutions. Given your ages and the length of time you've been missing, this would likely mean placements in different cities to ensure you receive appropriate services. The children exchanged glances, their worst fears being confirmed. However, Janet continued, your situation is far from standard. Dr. Yates has determined that you're all in good health, both physically and psychologically. Mr. Chun's interviews suggest that you've developed mature coping mechanisms and strong interpersonal skills. And my own assessment indicates that the bonds you've formed are genuine and beneficial. She paused, looking around the room at 7 young faces that had learned not to hope too much. Thomas has applied for emergency foster certification, and, given the unusual circumstances, we're prepared to expedite that process. If he passes the background checks and home inspection, And if you're all willing to cooperate with ongoing counseling and educational services, we can arrange for temporary group placement while we work on a more permanent solution." The silence in the room was profound. After months of uncertainty, the possibility of staying together seemed almost too good to be true. "What's the catch?" Emma asked, her street-smart instincts on high alert. "The catch is that this is temporary, and it's conditional. You'll need to return to school, either through the local district or through approved homeschooling programs. You'll need to participate in individual and group counseling to address the trauma of the fire and your time in the wilderness. And you'll need to demonstrate that you can function within the legal system, not outside of it." "And if we can't? If something goes wrong?" Marcus asked. "Then we'll have to reconsider the placement," Robert Chun said honestly. "But we're willing to try this approach because what you've accomplished together is remarkable. You've proven that you can take care of each other. Now you need to prove that you can let others help take care of you too." Thomas had been quiet throughout the discussion, but now he spoke up. "There's one more thing. This isn't just about you 7 staying together. It's about all of us, including me, learning to be a different kind of family. I've been alone for 20 years, and you've been taking care of yourselves for 3 months. We're all going to have to adjust." Lily, clutching her teddy bear, looked around at the faces of the people who had become her world. "Does this mean we can stay together?" "It means we can try," Janet said gently. "But it also means that all of you, including Thomas, are going to have to work harder than you've ever worked before. Not just to survive, but to thrive." Sarah looked around at her chosen family, seeing the hope beginning to dawn in their eyes. "We've been working hard for 3 months. We can keep working hard." "Then let's see if we can make this work," Janet said, closing her file folder. "But I want you to understand that this is just the beginning. The real challenge starts now." Outside, the Nevada sun was beginning to set over the vast landscape that had sheltered 7 children during their darkest hours. Inside Thomas Mitchell's ranch house, 8 people who had been strangers just days before were beginning the delicate process of building something new together, not just a foster placement, but a genuine family forged by choice, necessity, and the unbreakable bonds that form when people choose to care for each other despite impossible odds. The paperwork was just the beginning. The real story was just starting to unfold. The ranch transformed overnight from the solitary domain of one man into a bustling household of 8. What had seemed spacious for Thomas alone suddenly felt intimate and complex, with 7 young people navigating their new reality alongside him. The first challenge came within days of the official placement. Thomas discovered that feeding 8 people required not just more food, but an entirely different approach to meal planning, grocery shopping, and kitchen logistics. His weekly trips to Millbrook expanded into elaborate supply runs that required a pickup truck and careful coordination. Emma emerged as the natural organizer of household operations, but not without friction. She had learned efficiency in foster homes where resources were limited and cooperation was essential for survival. Thomas, accustomed to his own rhythms and systems, found himself adjusting to Emma's methodical approach to everything from laundry schedules to food storage. "We need to rotate cooking duties," Emma announced during their first full week together, standing in front of a hastily drawn chart she had posted on the refrigerator. 8 people, 7 days, everyone contributes according to their abilities. "I've been cooking for myself for 20 years, Thomas said mildly, studying the chart. "I think I can handle it." "With respect, Mr. Mitchell, you've been cooking for one person for 20 years. Cooking for 8 is completely different." The kitchen became a laboratory for negotiation. Marcus proved surprisingly skilled at breakfast preparation, his methodical nature suited to the repetitive tasks of pancakes and eggs. The twins developed an efficient system for washing dishes that involved Luke washing and Jake drying in a synchronized dance that made the chore look almost effortless. but it was David who solved their most persistent problem. At 10 years old, he had become fascinated by the ranch's water systems during their cave survival period. When Thomas's well pump began showing signs of strain from the increased household demand, David spent hours studying the system and proposed a solution. That involved redistributing water usage throughout the day. "The pump can handle the volume," David explained, crouched beside the well housing with Thomas, "but not all at once. If we stagger showers and laundry and cooking, the system has time to recover between peak demands." Thomas found himself impressed by the boy's intuitive understanding of mechanical systems. "Where did you learn about water pumps?" "I didn't. I learned about problem solving. The specific equipment is just details." 2 weeks into their placement, the issue of schooling reached a crisis point. The children had been out of formal education for nearly 4 months, and Nevada law required immediate enrollment in approved educational programs. The problem was that the nearest school district was 37 miles away, and the logistics of transportation were complicated by the fact that the children were spread across multiple grade levels. Janet Morrison arrived at the ranch on a Tuesday morning with enrollment papers and a stern expression. "We can't delay this any longer. The state requires educational continuity." Thomas had been dreading this conversation. "Janet, the nearest high school is an hour-and-a-half round trip. The middle school is 43 miles in a different direction. The elementary school is closer, but that still means 3 separate drop-off and pickup runs every day. That's 3 hours of driving. Minimum," Sarah calculated quickly. "Plus gas, plus wear on vehicles, plus the fact that Mr. Mitchell has a ranch to run." Robert Chun, who had accompanied Janet for this visit, consulted his notes. "There are provisions for homeschooling, but they require certified instruction and regular assessment." "I'm not certified to teach anything," Thomas said. "But we could." Emma interjected. The adults turned to look at her, surprised. "Not to teach each other everything, but to coordinate our own learning. We proved we can organize complex systems. Why can't we organize our own education?" What Emma proposed was ambitious and unconventional. Instead of traditional grade-level separation, she suggested a collaborative learning model where the older children took responsibility for helping the younger ones, while all of them pursued independent study in their areas of strength and interest. "Marcus is naturally good at math and science," Emma explained. "He could work ahead in those subjects while helping David and Lily with basic concepts. I'm strong in literature and writing. I could coordinate those areas for everyone. The twins have mechanical aptitude that goes way beyond their grade level." "And what about accreditation? Standardized testing? College preparation?" Robert Chun's skepticism was evident. Sarah stepped forward. "Mr. Chun, with respect, we've spent 3 months solving problems that most adults couldn't handle. We've demonstrated project management, resource allocation, conflict resolution, and crisis response. Don't you think we can figure out how to learn algebra and essay writing?" Thomas was studying the group with new interest. "What would you need from me?" "Transportation to the library once a week, internet access for research, materials and supplies, and supervision to make sure we're meeting state requirements," Sarah said. "You wouldn't have to teach us. You just have to make sure we're teaching ourselves effectively." The discussion continued for 2 hours, with Janet and Robert raising legitimate concerns about oversight, accountability, and educational standards. But gradually, a framework began to emerge that satisfied legal requirements while accommodating the practical realities of their situation. The Nevada Department of Education would approve a homeschool cooperative with Thomas as the supervising adult. The children would follow state curriculum guidelines, but would be allowed to adapt the pace and methodology to their individual needs. Monthly assessments would ensure they were meeting educational benchmarks, and annual standardized testing would provide objective measures of their progress. 3 weeks after the education plan was approved, something remarkable happened. Thomas discovered David in the ranch's workshop at 5 in the morning, carefully disassembling a broken irrigation pump with the concentration of a master mechanic. "Couldn't sleep?" Thomas asked, settling onto a nearby stool. "I kept thinking about the water pressure problems in the south pasture," David said without looking up from his work. "This pump has been making weird noises for a week, and yesterday it finally died. I wanted to see what went wrong." Thomas watched his 10-year-old hands methodically remove components, organizing them on the workbench with professional precision. "What have you found?" "The impeller bearings are shot. See these metal shavings? The whole assembly has been grinding itself apart, but the motor is fine and the housing is solid. We just need new bearings and maybe a new impeller." David held up a worn bearing, turning it in the morning light to show Thomas the damage. "In the cave, when something broke, we had to figure out how to fix it or replace it with something else. We couldn't just buy new parts." "What would you have done?" "In the cave?" David grinned. "Found a way to make new bearings out of stones and metal scraps, probably. It wouldn't have lasted long, but it would have worked until we found a better solution." Thomas was quiet for a moment, watching this child who spoke about mechanical problems with the casual confidence of someone twice his age. "David, what do you want to be when you grow up?" "I want to solve problems," David said simply. "I don't care if it's engines or irrigation systems, or something that hasn't been invented yet. I just want to figure out how things work and make them work better." That afternoon, Thomas made a comedy phone call to Jake Rodriguez, the owner of Millbrook's only auto repair shop. Jake had been struggling to find qualified help for months, and Thomas had an idea that might benefit everyone involved. "Jake, I've got a 10-year-old kid who just diagnosed a pump failure better than I could have. Are you interested in meeting him?" 2 days later, David spent his first afternoon at Rodriguez Auto Repair, officially as an observer, but actually as an enthusiastic apprentice. Jake, initially skeptical about having a child in his shop, quickly discovered that David's combination of natural mechanical aptitude and systematic problem-solving approach made him an invaluable assistant. "The kid doesn't just want to know how to fix things," Jake told Thomas over the phone that evening. "He wants to understand why they break in the first place. I've had grown men working for me who never ask the questions this kid asks." David's success at the repair shop created a template for the other children to pursue their own interests and talents beyond traditional academic subjects. Marcus began spending time with Dr. Patricia Yates, the nurse practitioner who had conducted their initial medical evaluation, learning about anatomy and physiology with an intensity that impressed medical professionals. Emma discovered that her organizational skills translated perfectly to business management, and she began helping Thomas with ranch operations, tracking expenses, coordinating supply deliveries, and managing the complex logistics of running a large operation with limited resources. The twins found their niche with the county's volunteer fire department, where their agility and teamwork proved invaluable for equipment maintenance and training exercises. At 13, they were too young for active firefighting, but their understanding of emergency protocols and their ability to work as a perfectly synchronized unit made them natural assistants for training programs. Katie's gift for understanding people's emotional needs led her to volunteer at the Millbrook Senior Center, where her ability to listen and connect with elderly residents filled a genuine community need. Sarah used her leadership skills to organize a tutoring program for younger students in town, while Lily's natural caregiving instincts made her a beloved helper at the local animal shelter. What was emerging was not just successful homeschooling, but genuine community integration. The children weren't just surviving in their new environment, they were contributing to it in ways that benefited everyone involved. 6 weeks into their placement, the first real crisis struck. Lily developed a severe case of bronchitis that rapidly progressed to pneumonia, requiring hospitalization in Carson City. The 47-mile trip to the hospital became a daily routine as the family took turns staying with her. But the stress revealed fault lines in their carefully constructed new life. Thomas had never dealt with serious childhood illness, and his anxiety manifested as overprotectiveness that frustrated the older children. Emma, accustomed to taking charge in emergencies, found herself clashing with hospital staff who insisted on treating her like a child rather than a caregiver. The twins became uncharacteristically quiet and withdrawn, while David threw himself into his mechanical projects with obsessive intensity. "We're falling apart," Sarah confided to Thomas during one of their late-night vigils at Lily's bedside. "For 3 months in the cave, we held together through everything. Now one of us gets sick, and we're all struggling." Thomas looked exhausted, his face drawn from weeks of worry and insufficient sleep. "Maybe we're trying too hard to be perfect. Maybe it's okay to struggle sometimes. But what if Janet and Robert decide we can't handle this? What if they use Lily's illness as evidence that we need to be in separate homes with more resources?" The fear was legitimate. Their placement was still temporary, still conditional on their ability to function as a stable family unit. A medical crisis that revealed their limitations could easily become grounds for separation. But something unexpected happened during Lily's recovery. The Millbrook community, which had initially viewed the arrival of 7 foster children with polite skepticism, rallied around the family in ways that surprised everyone involved. Jake Rodriguez closed his auto shop for an afternoon to drive David to the hospital when Thomas was needed elsewhere. Dr. Yates made house calls to check on Lily's progress, refusing any payment. The senior center organized meal deliveries for the entire household. Even the volunteer fire department offered to help with ranch chores so Thomas could focus on family responsibilities. "You know what this is?" Emma asked Thomas as they watched. "Neighbors unload groceries and casseroles from a steady stream of vehicles. Community," Thomas replied. "Something I forgot existed after 20 years of living alone." Lily recovered fully, but the crisis had revealed something important. Their experiment in alternative family structure wasn't just working for the 8 of them. It was enriching the entire community in ways that traditional foster placements rarely achieved. When Janet Morrison conducted her monthly evaluation at the end of Lily's recovery period, she found not just 7 children thriving in an unconventional placement, but an entire community that had embraced and supported their unique family structure. "I have to admit," Janet told Thomas privately, "this is not what I expected when we approved the temporary placement. What did you expect? Problems, conflicts, evidence that good intentions aren't enough to overcome the complexities of raising 7 children from difficult backgrounds." Janet paused, watching through the window as Marcus explained irrigation principles to 2 curious neighbors. "Instead, I'm seeing something I've never encountered in 20 years of social work, which is a family that's making everyone around them stronger, instead of just trying to survive on their own." The temporary placement was about to become something more permanent, but not without one final challenge that would test everything they had built together. The call came on a Thursday morning in October, 8 months after Thomas had first discovered the children's message carved in stone. Janet Morrison's voice carried a tension that immediately put Thomas on alert. "We have a problem. The FBI has opened an investigation into the children's disappearance. They're treating it as a potential kidnapping case." Thomas set down his coffee cup, feeling the familiar weight of bureaucratic complications settling over their hard-won stability. "Kidnapping, Janet, you know the circumstances. You approved the placement. I know that, and you know that, but the federal investigators don't know that. All they see is 7 children who were missing for 3 months, turned up at a remote ranch owned by a man with no previous connection to them, and are now living in an unconventional arrangement that doesn't fit standard protocols." Through the kitchen window, Thomas could see David and Marcus working on the broken irrigation pump, their heads bent together over the mechanical problem with the focused intensity that had become their trademark. Emma was hanging laundry on the line, efficiently managing a task that would have overwhelmed most adults. The twins were practicing their synchronized movements with volunteer fire department equipment, turning necessary maintenance into an almost choreographed performance. "What kind of investigation are we talking about?" Thomas asked. "Full background checks, financial audits, interviews with neighbors, examination of all communications and records. They want to understand how 7 missing children ended up in your custody and why standard placement procedures weren't followed." The irony was bitter. For 8 months, their unconventional family had been thriving. The children were excelling in their educational programs, contributing meaningfully to their community, and developing into confident, capable young adults. But success didn't matter to investigators who saw only irregularities in paperwork and deviations from standard procedures. "When do they arrive?" "Tuesday. 3 agents, possibly more." "Thomas, I need you to understand that this is serious. If they decide that proper procedures weren't followed, if they find any irregularities in how this placement was arranged, they have the authority to remove the children immediately." Thomas was quiet for several minutes, watching his chosen family go about their morning routines with the easy coordination that had developed over months of shared living. "Janet, do you regret approving the placement?" "No, absolutely not. What you've all accomplished here is remarkable. But that doesn't mean I can protect you from federal oversight." After hanging up, Thomas sat in his office for a long time, staring at the phone and trying to figure out how to explain to 7 young people that their entire world might be about to collapse again, not because they had failed, but because they had succeeded too well outside the boundaries of acceptable procedure. The family meeting that evening was one of the most difficult conversations they had ever shared. Thomas explained the situation as carefully as he could, emphasizing that the investigation was procedural rather than punitive. But the children understood the implications immediately. "They're going to try to separate us again," Emma said flatly. "After 8 months of proving that we work better together, they're going to use bureaucracy to tear us apart." "We don't know that," Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Maybe if we show them what we've accomplished." "Accomplishments don't matter to investigators," Marcus interrupted, his 13-year-old cynicism reflecting hard-earned wisdom about institutional thinking. "They care about following rules, not about whether the rules make sense." The twins exchanged one of their wordless communications. Then Luke spoke for both of them. "What do we need to do?" Thomas had been dreading this question because he didn't have a good answer. "We need to be completely transparent. Answer their questions honestly. Show them our records. Demonstrate that everything we've done has been in your best interests." "And if that's not enough?" Katie asked. The silence stretched uncomfortably, because everyone in the room knew that Thomas couldn't promise the outcome they all wanted. David, who had been uncharacteristically quiet throughout the discussion, finally spoke up. "In the cave, when we faced problems we couldn't solve directly, we found ways to work around them." "Maybe this is the same kind of problem." "What do you mean?" Thomas asked. "I mean, maybe we can't convince the investigators that our family is legal according to their rules. But maybe we can show them that separating us would cause more problems than keeping us together." It was Lily, now 9 years old and far more sophisticated than her age suggested, who articulated what David was getting at. "We document everything. We show them exactly what they'd be destroying if they split us up." Over the next 4 days, the family threw themselves into a documentation project that would have impressed professional researchers. They gathered evidence of their academic progress, their community contributions, their personal development, and their family stability. But more importantly, they prepared to demonstrate the intangible bonds that had sustained them through impossible circumstances. Special Agent Rebecca Hayes was a woman in her early 40s with the demeanor of someone accustomed to uncovering uncomfortable truths. She arrived at the ranch accompanied by Agent Michael Torres, a specialist in child trafficking cases, and Agent Linda Park, whose expertise was in institutional fraud and regulatory violations. The agents spent their first day conducting individual interviews in Thomas's living room, which had been rearranged to accommodate the formal proceedings. Their questions were thorough, professional, and designed to uncover any inconsistencies in the stories they had heard from local social services. "Sarah, can you walk me through the night of the fire one more time?" Agent Hayes asked, her recorder running and her notebook open. Sarah had told this story dozens of times over the past 8 months, but she understood that the agents needed to hear it directly from her. She described the smell of smoke, the blocked escape route, the decision to jump from the second-story window, and the terrible realization that they had been overlooked in the evacuation procedures. "And your decision to remain hidden rather than immediately seeking help. Can you explain the reasoning behind that choice?" "We knew from experience that the system prioritizes processing cases over maintaining relationships," Sarah said carefully. "We had all been separated from people we cared about before. We weren't willing to risk losing each other. But you were children. You had no way of knowing whether staying together was possible within the system." Agent Hayes, with respect: "We had extensive experience with the system. We knew exactly what was possible and what wasn't. What we didn't know was whether anyone would be willing to try something different." The agents interviewed each child separately, asking detailed questions about their time in the cave, their survival methods, their decision-making processes, and their current living situation. What emerged from these interviews was a picture of remarkable competence and maturity, but also of children who had been failed by traditional approaches to their care. Agent Torres, whose specialty was identifying trafficking situations, found no evidence of coercion or exploitation. "These children aren't victims of their current situation," he told his colleagues during a private consultation. "If anything, they appear to be thriving in ways that their previous placements never achieved." Agent Park's investigation into financial irregularities and procedural violations was more concerning. While she found no evidence of fraud or abuse, she did identify numerous instances where standard protocols had been bypassed or modified to accommodate the unusual circumstances of the placement. "The problem isn't what's happening now, Agent," Park explained to Agent Hayes. "The problem is how it happened. Emergency placements are supposed to be temporary bridges to permanent solutions, not long-term arrangements that bypass normal approval processes." Word of the federal investigation spread quickly through Millbrook, and the community's response surprised even the children who had come to take local support for granted. Jake Rodriguez organized a petition signed by 234 residents supporting the family's continued placement together. Dr. Patricia Yates provided detailed medical records demonstrating the children's excellent health and development. The volunteer fire department submitted a formal letter documenting the twins' contributions to community safety programs, but it was the senior center residents who provided the most compelling testimony. 12 elderly residents, many of whom had initially been skeptical of the unconventional family arrangement, requested individual meetings with the FBI agents to discuss Katie's impact on their community. "That girl has visited me every Tuesday for 6 months," 83-year-old Margaret Patterson told Agent Hayes. "She doesn't come because she's required to or because she's getting paid. She comes because she understands that loneliness is a real problem that requires real solutions." Margaret's voice gained strength as she continued. "You want to know if these children are being properly cared for. Let me tell you about Proper Care. Proper Care is a 10-year-old boy who spent his own allowance money to buy parts to fix my broken wheelchair. Proper Care is a 16-year-old girl who organized a tutoring program that's helped 15 local children improve their grades. Proper Care is a family that makes everyone around them better. The agents found themselves in the unusual position of investigating a case where the alleged victims were thriving. The alleged perpetrator was providing exemplary care, and the entire community was advocating for the status quo to continue. On the final day of the investigation, something happened that none of the agents had anticipated. Emma, who had been cooperative but guarded throughout the process, requested a private meeting with Agent Hayes. "There's something I need to tell you that might change your perspective on this case," Emma said, settling into the chair across from the agent with the careful composure she had developed over years of dealing with authority figures. "I'm listening. You're investigating whether Mr. Mitchell kidnapped us or coerced us into staying here. You're looking for evidence that we're being harmed or exploited. But you're asking the wrong questions." Agent Hayes raised an eyebrow. "What questions should I be asking?" "You should be asking what would happen to us if you separate us now. You should be asking whether the system that lost track of us for 3 months is really better equipped to care for us than the family we've built here. You should be asking whether following procedures is more important than protecting children." Emma paused, choosing her words carefully. "Agent Hayes, I've been in the foster care system since I was 6 years old. I've lived in 11 different homes, attended 14 different schools, and had 27 different caseworkers. I know how the system works, and I know how it fails. Emma, I understand that your experiences have been difficult. No, you don't understand. If you understood, you wouldn't be here trying to fix something that isn't broken." Emma's voice remained calm, but her intensity was unmistakable. "For the first time in my life, I'm part of a family that chose me and that I chose back. For the first time, I'm not wondering when I'll have to pack my bags and start over somewhere else. For the first time, I feel safe." Agent Hayes studied the 14-year-old girl across from her, recognizing the maturity and self-awareness that was rare in adults, let alone children. "What are you asking me to do?" "I'm asking you to be brave enough to recommend that the system try something different. I'm asking you to see that sometimes breaking rules is the only way to do what's right." Emma stood up, preparing to leave, then turned back one final time. "Agent Hayes, you have the power to destroy the best thing that's ever happened to any of us. I hope you'll use that power wisely." The agents spent their final evening at the ranch observing the family's dinner routine, a complex choreography of meal preparation, conversation, cleanup, and homework assistance that functioned with remarkable efficiency. They watched Thomas help Lily with her reading while David explained mechanical principles to Marcus. They observed Emma coordinating the next day's schedule while Sarah mediated a minor disagreement between the twins about fire department protocols. What they saw was not a foster placement or an emergency arrangement, but a functioning family unit that had developed its own culture, traditions, and support systems. "This is not what I expected to find," Agent Torres admitted to his colleagues as they prepared their final reports. "None of it is what I expected," Agent Hayes replied. "These children aren't victims. Thomas Mitchell isn't an opportunist. The local social workers aren't negligent. Everyone involved has been trying to solve an impossible problem with inadequate resources and inflexible regulations." Agent Park, who had been the most skeptical throughout the investigation, was reviewing her notes with obvious frustration. "Procedurally, this placement violates numerous federal guidelines for child welfare. Practically, it's the most successful alternative family arrangement I've ever encountered." The question that hung over their final deliberations was whether federal child welfare policy was designed to protect children or to protect agencies from liability. The answer would determine not just the fate of 7 young people, but the precedent for how similar cases might be handled in the future. As the agents finalized their reports, they were aware that their recommendations would ripple far beyond one ranch in Nevada. They were deciding whether the federal system was flexible enough to accommodate success that didn't fit standard templates, or whether bureaucratic consistency was more important than individual outcomes. The children went to bed that night, not knowing whether they would wake up as a family or as 7 separate wards of the state, scattered across different cities and different futures. Their fate rested in the hands of investigators who had arrived expecting to find exploitation and had instead discovered something far more complicated. A family that worked precisely because it had been built outside the boundaries of traditional expectations. The federal agents departed on Friday morning, leaving behind a family uncertain about their future and a community anxiously awaiting news that could change everything. Their final reports would be submitted to the Department of Health and Human Services within 72 hours, followed by an official determination that could either validate their unconventional family structure or dismantle it entirely. Thomas found himself unable to concentrate on routine ranch work, constantly checking his phone for calls that didn't come. The children continued their daily routines with forced normalcy, but underneath their composed exterior, tension simmered like a barely contained electrical current. "When will we know?" Lily asked during Saturday breakfast, her 9-year-old. Directness cutting through the adult's careful avoidance of the obvious question. "Soon," Thomas replied, though he had no more information than she did. "That's not an answer," David pointed out with his characteristic precision. "When exactly? Will the decision be announced?" Sarah intervened before the conversation could spiral into an anxiety-driven argument. "We don't know the timeline, and worrying about it won't change the outcome. What we can control is how we spend whatever time we have left together." Her words carried a mature acceptance that was both admirable and heartbreaking. At 17, Sarah had learned to prepare for disappointment while hoping for the best, a survival skill that no teenager should need to develop. The phone rang at 2:17 p.m. on Monday, exactly 96 hours after the agents had left the ranch. Thomas answered on the second ring, recognizing Janet Morrison's number on the caller ID. "Thomas, I have news. Can you gather everyone together?" The tone of her voice gave nothing away. Professionally neutral, carefully controlled. Thomas assembled the family in the living room, the same space where they had faced scrutiny from federal investigators just days earlier. "I'm going to put this call on speaker," Thomas announced, positioning the phone in the center of the coffee table, where everyone could hear clearly. Janet's voice filled the room. "The federal investigation has concluded, and the Department of Health and Human Services has issued their determination. The agents found no evidence of coercion, abuse, or regulatory violations that would justify immediate intervention." The silence that followed was profound, filled with held breath and cautious hope. "However," Janet continued, "the report identifies significant procedural irregularities in how the placement was arranged and maintained. The department is requiring a formal review of the entire case, including a comprehensive evaluation of Thomas's fitness as a long-term guardian." Emma's face had gone carefully blank, the expression she wore when preparing for bad news. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means that your current placement can continue temporarily while a more thorough assessment is conducted. But it also means that permanent custody arrangements must be formalized through proper legal channels within 6 months. Thomas felt relief and apprehension in equal measure. They had avoided immediate separation, but they were far from achieving permanent security. "What kind of formal evaluation are we talking about?" "Full psychological assessments for all family members, extended home studies, financial audits, educational evaluations, and most significantly, individual custody hearings for each child, where a judge will determine whether continued group placement serves their best interests." The implications were staggering. 7 separate custody hearings meant 7 separate opportunities for the system to decide that traditional placements would be preferable to their unconventional family structure. "What about adoption?" Marcus asked, his practical 13-year-old mind jumping to the most obvious solution. Adoption proceedings for 7 children simultaneously would be unprecedented and extremely complex. The legal requirements alone could take years to navigate. After Janet ended the call, the family sat in thoughtful silence, processing the reality of their situation. They had won a temporary victory, but the war for their right to stay together was far from over. That evening, the family held what David dubbed a tactical planning meeting, a systematic approach to preparing for the formal evaluation process that would determine their permanent fate. "We need to understand exactly what they'll be looking for," Sarah said, having appointed herself coordinator of their legal research. "If we're going to face 7 custody hearings, we need to be prepared for 7 different arguments about why staying together serves each person's individual best interests." Emma had been researching family law online for hours, and her findings were sobering. The system is designed around individual placements, not group placements. We need to prove that each of us would be harmed by separation, not just that we prefer staying together. Thomas watched the children organize their legal strategy with the same methodical approach they had applied to survival in the wilderness. Their ability to break complex problems into manageable components continued to impress him, even as he worried about the burden they were carrying. "What can I do to strengthen my position as a potential guardian?" Thomas asked. The twins had been researching guardian qualification requirements, and Luke presented their findings. "You need character references from community members, evidence of financial stability, completion of foster parent training programs, and demonstration of your ability to meet the individual needs of children from different age groups and backgrounds." "I can handle the practical requirements," Thomas said. "But I need you all to understand that I can't guarantee the outcome. The system might decide that 7 children is too many for one guardian, regardless of how well we're functioning as a family." Katie, now 13 and increasingly articulate about emotional dynamics, spoke up. "Mr. Mitchell, we know you can't promise us anything. But can you promise to keep trying until every option is exhausted?" Thomas looked around the room at 7 young faces that had learned to hope carefully, but never to stop hoping entirely. "I can promise that." Over the following weeks, the family threw themselves into preparation for the formal evaluation with the same intensity they had once applied to survival. Each child worked with Thomas to document their individual progress, accomplishments, and developmental needs in ways that would support their case for remaining together. David's mechanical aptitude had evolved into genuine engineering skills under Jake Rodriguez's mentorship. His portfolio now included detailed diagrams of irrigation improvements he had designed for the ranch, photographs of equipment he had repaired, and letters of recommendation from local contractors who had observed his work. Marcus's interest in medicine had developed into a structured pre-professional program under Dr. Patricia Yates's guidance. He had completed advanced coursework in anatomy and physiology, volunteered extensively in medical settings, and demonstrated a maturity that impressed healthcare professionals throughout the region. Emma's organizational abilities had transformed into leadership skills that benefited the entire community. She had coordinated volunteer programs, managed complex logistical challenges, and developed administrative systems that local organizations had adopted as permanent improvements. The twins' work with the volunteer fire department had evolved into a specialization in emergency response that was unusual for teenagers their age. They had completed certification programs, assisted with actual emergency calls, and developed training protocols that were being implemented by fire departments in other rural communities. Katie's emotional intelligence had found expression through her work with elderly residents, but also through peer counseling programs she had initiated at the senior center. At 13, she was facilitating support groups and conflict resolution sessions with a skill that surprised professional social workers. Sarah's natural leadership had matured into genuine advocacy skills. She had researched child welfare law, extensively corresponded with policy experts, and developed position papers about alternative family structures that were being circulated among social work professionals. Even Lily, now 9, had developed specialized skills that contributed to both family and community welfare. Her natural caregiving instincts had evolved into competency in animal care that made her an invaluable volunteer at the local veterinary clinic. 3 months into the evaluation process, their story attracted attention from a documentary filmmaker named Rachel Chun, who had been researching alternative approaches to child welfare for a project about systemic reform. Rachel's initial contact was professional but quickly became personal as she recognized the broader implications of their case. "Your situation represents something unprecedented in American child welfare," Rachel explained during her first visit to the ranch. "You've essentially created a successful alternative to traditional foster care, but you've done it outside the system rather than within it." The family was initially reluctant to participate in any media project, concerned that publicity might complicate their legal proceedings. But Rachel's approach was different from typical documentary filmmaking. She was less interested in their personal story than in the policy questions their case raised. "I'm not trying to exploit your situation," Rachel assured them. "I'm trying to document whether the child welfare system can adapt to accommodate success that doesn't fit traditional models." Sarah, who had become the family's de facto spokesperson for legal matters, was intrigued by the policy implications. "What kind of documentation would be helpful?" "Footage of your daily routines, interviews about your decision-making processes, testimony from community members about your impact, and most importantly, expert analysis of why your family structure works when traditional approaches have failed." The family agreed to limited participation, with the understanding that the documentary would focus on policy questions rather than personal drama. What emerged from Rachel's months of filming was a sophisticated analysis of how rigid, bureaucratic structures often prevented innovative solutions to complex social problems. As part of the formal evaluation process, the Department of Health and Human Services brought in outside experts to assess the family's functioning and provide recommendations about permanent placement. Dr. Amanda Foster, a specialist in family system psychology, spent 2 weeks observing their daily routines and conducting comprehensive assessments. Foster's initial skepticism gave way to professional fascination as she documented the family's communication patterns, conflict resolution strategies, and emotional support systems. Her preliminary report challenged fundamental assumptions about optimal family size and structure. This family unit demonstrates psychological health markers that exceed those found in most traditional nuclear families, Dr. Foster wrote. The children have developed secure attachment patterns, age-appropriate independent skills, and remarkably sophisticated emotional regulation abilities. But her most significant finding concerned the risks of separation. Disrupting this family system would constitute a form of psychological trauma that could have lasting developmental consequences. These children have not simply learned to live together. They have become psychologically interdependent in ways that support rather than compromise their individual growth. Dr. Foster's testimony carried substantial weight with legal professionals, but it also raised uncomfortable questions about why the traditional system had failed to recognize or accommodate the children's needs initially. As the evaluation process continued, it became clear that the family's case was highlighting fundamental contradictions in child welfare law. Attorney Michael Rodriguez, Jake's cousin and a specialist in family law, agreed to represent the family pro bono after reviewing their documentation. The legal system is designed to protect children by placing them in approved family structures, Michael explained during one of their strategy sessions. But your case demonstrates that the approved structures aren't always optimal for every child's needs. The legal challenges were complex and unprecedented. While individual adoption cases were routine, Simultaneous custody proceedings for 7 children who wanted to remain together had no legal precedent in Nevada. We're essentially asking the court to recognize a new category of family structure, Michael continued. That requires convincing judges that legal innovation serves children's interests better than legal consistency. The custody hearings were scheduled to begin in February, nearly a year after the federal investigation had begun. Each child would have separate representation, separate hearings, and separate determinations about their best interests, a process that could easily result in different outcomes for different family members. As news of the pending custody hearings spread throughout Millbrook and the surrounding region, community support took on new dimensions. Local residents organized fundraising events to help with legal expenses, wrote letters to state legislators about child welfare reform, and prepared to testify about the family's positive impact on their community. But the most significant support came from an unexpected source: other families who had faced similar challenges with the child welfare system. Parents who had struggled to maintain sibling groups, adoptive families who had been separated by bureaucratic requirements, and former foster children who had aged out of the system without ever finding permanent families began reaching out to share their stories. Your case has given voice to something that many of us have experienced but never knew how to articulate, wrote Maria Santos, a former foster child who had been separated from her siblings 20 years earlier. You're fighting for the right of children to define their own families, and that fight matters to more people than you realize. The growing network of support represented more than just encouragement. It was evidence that their situation reflected broader systemic problems that affected thousands of families across the country. As February approached and the custody hearings loomed, the family found themselves at the center of a conversation about fundamental questions. Who has the authority to define what constitutes a family? How should society balance individual children's needs against systemic requirements? And most importantly, what happens when doing the right thing requires breaking the rules? The answers to those questions would determine not just their own future, but the precedent for how similar cases might be handled throughout the American child welfare system. 7 young people who had once hidden in a desert cave were about to discover whether the legal system was as adaptable as they had proven themselves to be. The Carson City Courthouse had never hosted proceedings quite like these. 7 consecutive custody hearings for 7 young people who refused to be separated, presided over by Judge Maria Gonzalez, a veteran of complex family law cases who understood that her decisions would establish precedent far beyond Nevada. Sarah's hearing came first on a cold Monday morning in February. At 17, she was approaching the age where the court's authority would naturally diminish, but her testimony would set the tone for everything that followed. Sarah, you could petition for emancipation and make your own living arrangements, Judge Gonzalez observed. Why do you want to remain in a guardianship situation with 6 younger children? Sarah had prepared for this question, but her answer came from the heart rather than from legal strategy. Your Honor, emancipation would solve my immediate legal problems, but it would abandon 6 people who depend on me and whom I depend on. A family isn't something you graduate from when you turn 18. Attorney Michael Rodriguez presented evidence of Sarah's academic achievements, leadership skills, and community contributions, but the most compelling testimony came from unexpected sources. 3 college admissions officers had driven to Carson City to testify that Sarah's unique background and demonstrated leadership made her a compelling candidate for their institutions, with the understanding that she would remain connected to her chosen family. We're not just offering Sarah admission, explained Dr. Patricia Wong from Nevada State University. We're offering to work with her family to ensure that her education enhances rather than disrupts the family structure that has produced such remarkable young people. Emma's hearing the following day focused on her history of multiple foster placements and the psychological impact of her current stability. Dr. Amanda Foster's testimony was particularly powerful, documenting how Emma's behavioral and academic improvements correlated directly with her sense of permanent belonging. Emma has lived in 11 different foster homes, Dr. Foster explained to Judge Gonzalez. In none of those placements did she demonstrate the emotional regulation, academic progress, or social development that she has achieved in the past year. Separating her from this family structure would likely result in regression that could take years to overcome. The proceedings continued through the week, with each child's case building on the last. Marcus's medical aspirations, supported by recommendations from healthcare professionals throughout the region. David's engineering aptitude, documented through projects that had impressed university professors. The twins' emergency response specialization, validated by fire departments across 3 counties, but it was Katie's hearing that provided the emotional turning point. Her work with elderly residents had attracted attention from gerontology, researchers studying intergenerational relationships and their impact on both children and seniors. Katie represents something we rarely see in formal care settings, testified Dr. Robert Kim, a specialist in developmental psychology. She has learned to find purpose through service to others, not because she was required to, but because she was given the security and support to explore her natural empathy. Lily's hearing, as the youngest family member, focused on attachment theory and the psychological risks of separating a 9-year-old from the only stable family structure she had known. Child advocacy groups had submitted briefs arguing that her well-being should take precedence over procedural convenience. During the final week of hearings, something remarkable happened that surprised everyone involved in the case. The Department of Health and Human Services, which had initiated the investigation that led to these proceedings, submitted a brief supporting the family's petition to remain together. Janet Morrison, who had shepherded their case from the beginning, testified about the policy implications of the family's success. In 23 years of social work, I have never encountered a placement that has achieved such positive outcomes for so many children simultaneously. To separate them now would ignore evidence in favor of bureaucratic consistency. The department's position reflected a broader recognition that rigid application of existing policies was preventing innovative solutions to complex problems. Their support carried significant weight with Judge Gonzalez, who had been grappling with the tension between legal precedent and practical outcomes. But the most surprising testimony came from Robert Chun, the social worker who had initially been skeptical of their arrangement. His research into their case had led him to question fundamental assumptions about optimal family structure and size. Judge Gonzalez, these children have created something that our system failed to provide. A stable, nurturing environment where each individual can thrive while contributing to the well-being of the whole. The question isn't whether their family structure is conventional. It's whether conventional structures have served these particular children as well. Judge Gonzalez announced her decision on a Friday afternoon in late February, nearly 13 months after Thomas had first discovered the children's message carved in stone. The courtroom was packed with community members, legal observers, and advocates from across the country who understood the broader implications of her ruling. This case has required me to consider fundamental questions about the purpose of child welfare law, Judge Gonzalez began. Is our goal to enforce standardized procedures, or is it to ensure that children receive the care and support they need to develop into healthy, productive adults? She reviewed the evidence methodically, the children's academic progress, their psychological evaluations, their community contributions, the expert testimony about the risks of separation, and the unprecedented level of community support for their continued placement together. The evidence demonstrated conclusively that these 7 young people have thrived in an unconventional family structure in ways that traditional placements had failed to achieve. More importantly, the evidence suggests that separating them would cause psychological harm that could undermine years of positive development. Judge Gonzalez paused, looking directly at the family seated in the front row of the courtroom. Therefore, this court grants permanent guardianship of all 7 children to Thomas Mitchell, with the understanding that this arrangement will be subject to standard annual reviews, but will not be disrupted absent evidence of harm or neglect. Reaction was immediate and emotional. The children remained composed, but Thomas found himself overwhelmed by relief and responsibility in equal measure. In the gallery, community members who had supported the family throughout their legal ordeal celebrated quietly, understanding that they had witnessed something unprecedented in American family law. 6 months later, documentary filmmaker Rachel Chun premiered her film Chosen Family at the Sundance Film Festival, where it won the Audience Award for Best Documentary. The film had evolved beyond their specific case to examine how rigid institutional thinking often prevented innovative solutions to social problems. The family story had attracted attention from policy researchers, child welfare advocates, and legislators interested in reform. Sarah was invited to testify before a congressional subcommittee studying foster care reform, while Emma spoke at social work conferences about the importance of preserving family bonds. But perhaps the most significant impact was on other families facing similar challenges. The legal precedent established by their case provided a framework for keeping sibling groups together, supporting kinship care arrangements, and recognizing alternative family structures. Thomas, meanwhile, had discovered that his ranch had become an informal model for rural foster care. State officials regularly visited to study their approach to education, community integration, and family management. He found himself advising other potential guardians who wanted to provide homes for multiple children. The family's legal victory triggered a wave of policy discussions that extended far beyond Nevada's borders. Within months of Judge Gonzalez's ruling, 3 other states began pilot programs designed to keep sibling groups together in foster care. The Mitchell model, as child welfare professionals began calling it, offered a framework for rural communities to provide care for multiple children through single guardian arrangements. Dr. Patricia Wong from Nevada State University established the Alternative Family Structures Research Center, dedicated to studying innovative approaches to child welfare. She recruited Sarah as a student researcher, recognizing that the young woman's lived experience provided insights that academic theory alone couldn't capture. Traditional research approaches this backwards, Sarah explained during her first presentation to the Research Center's advisory board. They start with policies and try to fit children into them. We need to start with children's actual needs and design policies that serve those needs. The Research Center's work attracted attention from the Department of Health and Human Services, which commissioned a comprehensive study of alternative placement strategies. Emma, despite being only 16, was invited to serve on the advisory committee, bringing the perspective of someone who had experienced both system failure and innovative success. Meanwhile, attorney Michael Rodriguez found himself inundated with requests from families across the country facing similar challenges. He established a nonprofit legal clinic specializing in complex custody cases involving sibling groups, kinship care arrangements, and other non-traditional family structures. What started as one family's fight for the right to stay together has become a movement to reform how we think about family, Michael explained to a gathering of family law attorneys in Washington, D.C. We're not just changing individual outcomes, we're changing the system itself. Rachel Chun's documentary, Chosen Family, achieved something rare in advocacy filmmaking. It changed actual policy rather than just raising awareness. The film's premiere at Sundance led to screenings at social work conferences, policy summits, and legislative hearings across the country. The documentary's most powerful segment featured interviews with the elderly residents at Millbrook Senior Center, whose relationships with Katie had become a model for intergenerational programming in rural communities. The film showed how the children's integration into their community had created benefits that extended far beyond their own family unit. These kids didn't just survive, they made everyone around them stronger, reflected Margaret Patterson, the 83-year-old resident whose relationship with Katie had become central to the documentary's narrative. That's what real family does. It makes the whole community better. The film's success led to invitations for the family to speak at conferences and universities throughout the country. Thomas found himself advising rural communities on how to develop resources for complex foster care situations, while the children shared their experiences with audiences of social workers, policymakers, and other young people in care. Each family member had developed expertise that contributed to the broader movement for child welfare reform. David's engineering projects had evolved into partnerships with university researchers studying sustainable technology for rural communities. His designs for water management and renewable energy systems were being implemented on ranches throughout the region. Marcus's medical interests had attracted the attention of rural health advocates, who recognized that his combination of technical knowledge and community understanding made him an ideal candidate for addressing healthcare access in underserved areas. He began working with telemedicine programs that connected rural patients with specialists in urban centers. The twins' work with emergency services had led to the development of new training protocols for volunteer firefighters in isolated communities. Their ability to function as a perfectly coordinated team made them valuable instructors for emergency response techniques that relied on precise communication and trust. Katie's emotional intelligence had found expression through a peer counseling program she developed for other children in the foster care system. At 14, she was facilitating support groups for young people struggling with placement transitions, using techniques she had learned through her own experience of finding stability. Emma's organizational abilities had attracted attention from nonprofit management experts who recognized her talent for coordinating complex projects with limited resources. She began consulting with organizations struggling to manage services for vulnerable populations, bringing insights from her experience of building family structures from nothing. Sarah's advocacy work had evolved into genuine political engagement. She testified before state legislatures, participated in policy working groups, and developed position papers that were cited by researchers and activists throughout the country. At 18, she was already recognized as a leading voice in child welfare reform. Even Lily, now 10, had developed specialized skills that contributed to their community's well-being. Her work at the animal shelter had evolved into a therapeutic program that paired rescue animals with children facing emotional challenges, creating healing relationships that benefited both species. 3 years after Judge Gonzalez's ruling, the family received a letter that demonstrated the far-reaching impact of their story. It came from Maria Santos, the former foster child who had written to them during their legal proceedings. "Because of your case, my 3 younger siblings and I were able to petition for reunification after 15 years of separation," Maria wrote. "The legal precedent you established gave us the framework to argue that our bonds as siblings hadn't been severed by time or distance. Last month, a judge in California ruled that we could legally restore our family ties." Maria's letter was one of dozens that arrived from families throughout the country who had used the legal precedent established by their case to fight for their own right to stay together or reunite. The impact extended beyond sibling groups to include kinship care arrangements, blended families, and other non-traditional structures that had previously struggled for recognition. The family's influence on policy was documented in academic studies, legal journals, and government reports. Their case was cited in congressional hearings, referenced in Supreme Court briefs, and studied in law schools as an example of how individual advocacy could drive systemic change. On a warm evening in June, exactly 3 years after the federal investigation had threatened to tear them apart, The family returned to the desert cave where their journey had begun. The message they had carved into stone was still there, weathered but readable, telling the story of 7 children who had chosen to stay together against impossible odds. But this time, they weren't alone. With them came Dr. Patricia Wong and her research team, documenting the site for a historical preservation project. The cave would be designated as a landmark in the history of child welfare reform, with interpretive materials explaining how this remote location had become the birthplace of a national movement. "Look how far we've come," Lily said, now 11 years old and reading the carved words with the fluency that 3 years of excellent education had provided. David, 13 and already accepted into a special engineering program at the state university, ran his fingers over the mechanical diagrams he had etched into the cave walls during their survival period. "We solved every problem we faced then. We're still solving problems now, just bigger ones." The twins, now 16 and certified volunteer firefighters, examined their old sleeping areas with the analytical eye of emergency responders. "We thought this was the safest place in the world," Luke observed. "It was," Jake replied, "but not because of the cave. Because we were together. And now we know that feeling of safety can exist anywhere, as long as we choose to protect each other." Emma, 17 and preparing to study social work with a specialization in policy reform, was photographing the cave for a presentation. She was preparing about alternative approaches to child welfare. "This place taught us that family isn't about where you come from, it's about who you choose to protect. But it also taught us that our choices can influence other people's choices." Marcus, 16 and already volunteering at the hospital while completing advanced medical coursework, was studying the primitive first aid supplies they had assembled during their time in the cave. "We learned to take care of each other here. Now we're learning to help other people take care of each other." 2. Sarah, 19 and beginning her sophomore year at university, while remaining connected to her chosen family, stood at the cave entrance looking out over the vast desert landscape that had once seemed so threatening. "We survived here because we had something worth surviving for. Now we're thriving because we have something worth fighting for." Thomas, watching his chosen children explore the place where their family had truly begun, reflected on how much all their lives had changed. 3 years ago, he had been a lonely rancher living in isolation. Now he was the guardian of 7 remarkable young people who had taught him that family was not something you were born into, but something you built through choice, commitment, and unconditional support. More than that, he had become part of a movement that was changing how society understood family itself. As the sun set over the Nevada desert, 8 people who had become family against impossible odds made their way back to the ranch that had become their permanent home. Behind them, carved forever in desert stone, their original message remained as a testament to the power of choosing love over fear, hope over despair, and family over convenience. But now their message extended far beyond the cave walls. It was written in law books and policy manuals, spoken in courtrooms and conference halls, lived out in communities across the country where other families had found the courage to fight for their right to stay together. They had started as 7 orphaned children hiding in a cave. They had become something unprecedented, a family that had changed not just their own lives, but the very definition of what family could mean in America. Their message, carved in stone and written in the law books, would endure long after they had grown up and moved on to build families of their own. But that night, they were simply what they had always chosen to be, 7 young people and 1 adult who had decided that staying together was worth any struggle, any risk, any fight against a system that said it couldn't be done. In the end, they had proven that the most powerful force in child welfare wasn't policy or procedure or institutional wisdom. It was the simple, radical decision of people to take care of each other, no matter what the cost. And once that decision was made visible, documented, and defended, It became a beacon for others who had never dared to believe that such choices were possible. Their cave in the Nevada desert had become more than a shelter. It had become a symbol of what was possible when children were allowed to define family for themselves, when communities chose to support unconventional solutions to complex problems, and when legal systems found the courage to adapt to human needs rather than forcing humans to adapt to institutional convenience. The 7 children who had once carved their story into stone had grown up to carve their story into the very foundations of American child welfare law. And in communities across the country, other children were discovering that they too had choices, that they too could fight for the families they needed, and that they too could transform survival into something that looked very much like victory. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.